Hello everyone, welcome to Financhist. Today we expose the brutal reality of financial cannibalism, a system where the powerful consume the wealth of the weak, and there is no bigger example than Britain's looting of India. India was 25% of the global economy, until Britain drained its wealth, destroyed its industries, and built an empire on stolen resources. So, how did Britain loot and exploit India? Let's break down the mechanism of this financial cannibalism. For nearly 200 years, the British Empire held sway over the Indian subcontinent. But what was the real economic impact of this rule? It all started not with soldiers, but with traders. The British East India Company arrived in the early 17th century, seeking spices, textiles, and other valuable goods. For about 150 years, trade was relatively balanced. Britain paid for Indian goods with silver, and it was a fair exchange. But everything changed after the Battle of Plassey in 1757. This battle wasn't just a military victory, it was a corporate takeover. The East India Company effectively seized control of Bengal, one of the richest provinces in the world at the time. With this power, they no longer needed to pay for Indian goods. Instead, they began to use a clever and deeply exploitative system. Here's how it worked. The company collected taxes from the Indian people. A portion of these tax revenues was then used to buy Indian products, textiles, indigo, saltpeter, you name it. These goods were then shipped to Britain and sold for a massive profit. So Indians were essentially forced to pay for the privilege of having their own goods taken from them. The silver that once flowed into India completely dried up. Instead, India's own wealth was used to buy its own exports. This system was the foundation of the colonial drain. The renowned economist Utsa Patnaik has estimated that between 1765 and 1938, Britain drained a staggering $45 trillion from India. Let that number sink in. 45 trillion. That's not an inflation-adjusted figure of a few billion. It's a calculation based on the compounded value of the drained resources over time. It's more than Britain's entire GDP today. But the exploitation didn't stop there. After the Industrial Revolution, Britain's economic needs changed. They no longer wanted India as a producer of finished goods. Instead, they wanted it to be a source of cheap raw materials for their factories and a captive market for their manufactured products. This led to a policy of deindustrialization. India had been a global leader in textile manufacturing for centuries. Its fabrics, like muslin from Dhaka, were legendary. But Britain systematically dismantled this industry. They imposed heavy tariffs on Indian textiles entering Britain, making them uncompetitive. At the same time, they flooded the Indian market with cheap, machine-made textiles from Manchester. Indian weavers, who had practiced their craft for generations, couldn't compete. Millions lost their livelihoods. From being a net exporter of textiles, India was transformed into a net importer. This policy shift was devastating. It pushed countless artisans and skilled workers back into agriculture, placing immense pressure on the land. Let's talk about that agriculture. The British introduced radical changes to land ownership. They implemented systems like the zamindari system, which created a new class of landlords loyal to the British. These zamindars were tasked with collecting taxes, often at exorbitant rates, from the peasants. Failure to pay meant losing your land. This system prioritized revenue collection above all else. Farmers were forced to switch from growing food crops for their own consumption to cash crops like indigo, cotton, and opium, which the British wanted for export. This had catastrophic consequences. When a drought or a flood hit, there were no surplus food stocks. This shift from food security to cash crop cultivation was a major contributor to the series of devastating famines that swept across India under British rule. Historians like Mike Davis, in his book Late Victorian Holocausts, argue that these famines were not natural disasters, they were man-made. During the Great Famine of the late 1870s, millions of Indians starved to death. At the same time, colonial administrators were exporting record amounts of grain from India to Britain. The infrastructure, like the newly built railways, wasn't used to transport food to famine-stricken areas. Instead, it was used to transport raw materials to the ports for export. The logic of profit and empire trumped human life. The railways themselves are often cited as a positive legacy of British rule. And yes, they did connect the subcontinent, but their primary purpose was strategic and economic, not for the benefit of the Indian people. They were designed to move troops quickly to quell rebellions and to transport raw materials from the interior to the coastal ports. The construction was also financed through a system that guaranteed high returns to British investors, paid for, of course, by Indian taxpayers. Let's look at another aspect: salaries and pensions. A significant portion of India's tax revenue was spent on paying the salaries, pensions, and administrative costs of the British officials who governed the country. This was called the home charges. Essentially, India was paying for its own occupation. All the costs of the India office in London, the pensions of retired British officers living in England, and even the costs of British military campaigns outside of India were charged to the Indian taxpayer. This financial drain bled the country dry. While Britain was investing heavily in its own infrastructure, education, and healthcare, using the wealth extracted from its colonies, India was being starved of the capital it needed to develop. When the British left in 1947, India's share of the world economy had collapsed from around 24% in the early 18th century to just 4%. Literacy rates were abysmal, below 20%, and life expectancy was tragically low, around 31 years. The British built a system designed for one purpose: to enrich Britain. From manipulating trade and destroying industries to imposing punitive taxes and enabling famines, the economic policies of the Raj were a masterclass in exploitation. The wealth that fueled Britain's industrial revolution and built the grand cities of London, Liverpool, and Manchester was, in significant part, taken from the fields and factories of India. Understanding this history is not about assigning blame or dwelling on the past. It's about acknowledging the complex economic forces that have shaped our modern world. It helps explain the vast economic disparities we see today between the global north and south. The legacy of this colonial drain is not just a historical footnote. It has had lasting consequences that continue to affect the economic trajectory of India and other former colonies. The story of British India is a sobering reminder of how power can be used to create and sustain wealth for one nation at the direct expense of another. Thank you for watching. If you found this breakdown insightful, please hit the like button, share this video, and subscribe to Financial for more deep dives into economic history.